At the hospital, the doctor said, "We're removing your son's leg today." I was in the pre-op waiting room when the surgeon dropped this bombshell on me. "What?" "He's here to get his tonsils removed." I set down my coffee and stared at him. "Says here that his leg is to be amputated because of his diabetes." He showed me the chart. There it was in black and white. Sean Hopkins, age 12, below-knee amputation for severe diabetic complications. But Sean didn't have diabetes. We'd done blood work last week. Everything was normal. This had to be some kind of system error. "This is wrong. You need to stop this right now." I stood up, feeling my heart race. "Sir, he's already in OR3. They took him back 30 minutes ago." I didn't even think, just stood up and ran. I pushed past nurses and dodged gurneys in the hallway, followed the signs to the surgical wing. A security guard tried to stop me at the restricted access doors, but I shoved through anyway. The alarms started blaring as I searched for OR3. Through the window, I could see Sean on the table, already draped, already surrounded by the surgical team. I pounded on the glass, screaming for them to stop. The circulating nurse looked up annoyed and pointed to a phone on the wall. "Stop the surgery." "He doesn't have diabetes," I shouted into the intercom. They couldn't hear me properly through the masks and surgical equipment noise. One of them made a cutting gesture, either telling me to be quiet or indicating they were about to cut. I didn't wait to find out which. The door was locked electronically. I grabbed a fire extinguisher and smashed it against the handle until something broke. Security was running toward me as I burst into the operating room, contaminating their sterile field. Everyone started yelling at once. "Check his blood work from last week. He's not diabetic." I moved toward the table. 2 orderlies grabbed me and started dragging me out. Over their shoulders, I could see the surgeon holding a scalpel, the anesthesiologist checking monitors, Sean unconscious and prepped. They pulled me into the hallway as the surgeon yelled about calling the police. I broke free and ran to the nurse's station. Grabbed the phone and called Sasha. She had to know something, had to help me stop this. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding weirdly calm for someone whose son was in surgery. "They're cutting off his leg. You have to call them." I was screaming into the phone. "Honey, calm down. It's all arranged." Her voice was steady and cold. "What do you mean arranged?" "My friend Harper helped update the medical records. Disabled kids get much better college scholarships. I've researched everything." The world tilted. My wife had done this. She had falsified our son's medical records and arranged for his healthy leg to be amputated, all for college money. I dropped the phone and ran back to OR3, but security was blocking the door. Through the window, I could see them working, see the surgical drapes moving, see the concentration on the surgeon's face as he made precise movements. They weren't stopping. They weren't checking anything. They were cutting off my 12-year-old son's healthy foot. I fought the security guards, screamed about fraud and falsified records. They pinned me down and called the police. By the time Detective Walter arrived and understood what I was saying, it was too late. They'd already removed Sean's foot, already cauterized and closed, already made my healthy son disabled. They arrested Sasha at her book club. The surgical team was horrified when they learned the truth, but none of that gave Sean his foot back. None of that undid what my wife had orchestrated. I was in recovery when Sean woke up, watched his confusion turn to horror as he realized something was wrong. He felt his foot wasn't there and started crying and asking why. I couldn't speak. My phone rang. Sasha calling from jail. I answered because I needed to hear her try to justify this. "Did they remove it?" She sounded excited. "What's wrong with you?" "Trust me, this is all part of my plan. Start looking at mansions. We're gonna be rich." The hospital would settle for millions to avoid publicity. Disability benefits would kick in immediately. Every college in the country would want him. Speaking fees, book deals, documentary rights. She'd calculated every revenue stream from our son's amputation. "I've already got lawyers calling me," she continued. "Medical malpractice, failure to verify, emotional distress. We'll own that hospital by the time we're done." "The beauty is they can't undo it," she said proudly. "Reattachment window is closed. He'll adapt. Kids are resilient, and we'll never worry about money again." I slammed the phone down so hard the receiver cracked against the base. Turned back to Sean, who was crying harder now with his small hands reaching down toward where his foot should be. The nurses kept trying to comfort him, but he just kept asking why over and over. I opened my mouth but couldn't find any words that made sense. "How do you tell a 12-year-old his mom did this on purpose for money?" A woman in a dark suit appeared in the doorway with 2 security guards behind her. She asked me to step outside to discuss the situation, but I grabbed Sean's hand and refused to move. She looked uncomfortable as she started explaining they were launching an immediate investigation into the surgical error. Sean listened to every word while tears rolled down his face. The security guard stood there watching me like I might run or start breaking things again. Detective Walter came back 20 minutes later with his notebook out, asking about Harper, and when Sasha might have started planning this. Something clicked in my brain, and I remembered Sasha mentioning 3 months ago that Harper got a new job at some medical records company. She'd been so excited about it, and now I understood why. The detective wrote everything down and asked more questions about their friendship and any other conversations about money or Sean's future. The surgeon appeared in the doorway looking like he hadn't slept in days, even though it had only been a few hours. He asked if he could explain what happened from his perspective, and I just nodded because I was too tired to fight anymore. He said the chart was perfect with detailed notes across multiple systems and labs and imaging reports, all confirming severe diabetes. Everything matched, so questioning it never even occurred to him or his team. His voice cracked when he said he has kids too, and he would never have done this if he'd known. My phone buzzed with a text from Reed saying he was on his way, and I felt relief wash over me. Reed arrived 30 minutes later and took one look at Sean before grabbing my arm and pulling me into the hallway. He said we needed to focus on what Sean needs right now, not what Sasha did, even though I could see he was just as angry. The risk manager introduced herself with a practiced smile and started talking about next steps and support services in that careful way lawyers talk. She handed me a business card for their patient advocate, but I could tell from her eyes she was more worried about lawsuits than my son. Reed went back in to sit with Sean while I stood there listening to her explain all the resources they would provide. Hours passed, and Sean finally fell asleep from exhaustion and whatever pain medication they'd given him. I sat in the chair next to his bed, watching his chest rise and fall while machines beeped around us. Reed brought me coffee from the cafeteria, and we didn't talk, just sat there trying to process this nightmare that had become our reality. The coffee tasted like dirt, but I drank it anyway because I needed something to do with my hands. Morning came too fast with harsh fluorescent lights and the sounds of the hospital waking up around us. A social worker from CPS knocked on the door and introduced herself with a gentle voice that didn't match the clipboard in her hands. She asked questions about our home and if it was safe for Sean and whether I could care for him alone. I realized they were investigating whether I knew about this or could have prevented it somehow. She wrote down everything I said and asked to see my phone to verify when I'd learned about the surgery. Reed answered her questions too, confirming he'd only found out when I texted him frantically from the hospital. The social worker said she'd need to do a home visit once Sean was discharged, and I just nodded because what choice did I have? My phone rang again, showing Sasha's name from the jail number, and this time Reed grabbed it before I could. She started talking immediately about lawyers contacting her and book deal possibilities, and how Sean would be inspirational. Reed hung up on her mid-sentence and deleted the voicemail notification that popped up right after. A woman with a bright smile and scrubs covered in cartoon characters knocked and said she was the physical therapist. She started explaining the long road ahead with prosthetics and rehabilitation while pulling charts and pamphlets from her bag. Sean woke up during her explanation, but wouldn't look at his leg or at her cheerful demonstrations of how the prosthetic would work. She kept talking about how well kids adapt and all the activities he'd still be able to do, but Sean just turned his face toward the wall. I wanted to tell her to stop, but knew she was just doing her job trying to help in the only way she knew how. The detective came back with more questions and updates about Harper's arrest and the evidence they were gathering. Reed took Sean to the bathroom while the detective explained the criminal charges they were building against both women. The risk manager appeared again with more paperwork and consent forms for various treatments and services they were offering. I signed where she pointed without really reading anything because my brain couldn't process legal language right now. Detective Walter showed up an hour later with news about Harper and pulled me into a small meeting room down the hall. He spread out printed screenshots of text messages between Harper and Sasha on the table while explaining they'd arrested Harper at her apartment that morning with her laptop still open to the hospital's record system. The messages went back 3 months with Harper sending Sasha screenshots of different kids' medical files and asking which conditions would work best for their plan. Harper had written things like, "Diabetes is perfect because it requires immediate action," and "I can backdate the diagnosis to make it look legitimate," while Sasha responded with heart emojis and promises of payment. The detective pointed to one message where Harper bragged about having admin access to 3 different hospital systems and how easy it was to change records without anyone noticing. She'd altered files for 12 other patients as practice runs before doing Sean's, testing how long changes took to sync across departments and which diagnoses triggered automatic surgical scheduling. The detective said Harper tried to blame everything on Sasha when they arrested her, but the messages showed she was excited about the money and even suggested making the amputation bilateral for a bigger payout. The hospital's lawyer appeared at the door with another administrator who introduced herself as the patient relations director, and they both sat down with careful movements like they were afraid of breaking something. They offered to cover all of Sean's medical expenses going forward, plus a room at the hotel across the street for as long as we needed it, speaking in that measured tone people use when they're scared of lawsuits. The lawyer kept using phrases like good faith gesture and supporting your family through this difficult time, while never actually admitting the hospital did anything wrong. Reed texted me that he'd found a disability rights lawyer named Nolan Archer who was driving up from the city and would be here in 2 hours. The next morning, Nolan arrived carrying 3 boxes of documents and set up in the hotel room the hospital provided, spreading papers across every surface while explaining how we'd approach both the civil case and supporting the criminal prosecution. He'd already pulled Sean's complete medical history from our regular doctor, showing perfect health for 12 years. No diabetes, no complications, nothing that would justify amputation. He showed me similar cases where hospitals had performed wrong-site surgeries or unnecessary procedures, explaining how settlements worked and what we could realistically expect, but kept coming back to the fact that money wouldn't give Sean his foot back. Reed had taken time off work without me even asking, and showed up at the hospital every morning with his laptop and measuring tape, researching everything we'd need to modify the house for Sean. He found companies that installed grab bars and ramps, looked up reviews for different contractors, made spreadsheets comparing costs and timelines for modifications. He drove to our house while I stayed with Sean and measured doorways, bathroom layouts, the height of counters and light switches, taking pictures of everything so we could plan changes without leaving the hospital. He ordered books about parenting kids with disabilities and started reading them in the waiting room, highlighting sections and making notes in the margins. The risk manager called me into a conference room 3 days later for what she called a system review meeting, where she admitted their electronic records had shown irregularities for months that nobody investigated. She pulled up audit logs showing Harper's account accessing records at odd hours, making changes to closed files, viewing patients she had no reason to access, all red flags their security team missed. There had been complaints from nurses about records not matching their handwritten notes, lab results that disappeared and reappeared with different values, diagnosis codes that changed between shifts, but IT dismissed them as user error. She showed me emails where staff reported these issues and got responses saying the system was working fine, no investigation needed, just learn to use the computer properly. That night, Sean woke up screaming that someone was cutting him again, thrashing in the hospital bed and pulling at his bandages while crying for them to stop. I grabbed his hands to keep him from hurting himself while he sobbed about feeling the knife going through his leg over and over. The night nurse rushed in with warm blankets and helped me hold him until the panic passed, then sat with us for an hour telling stories about her kids to help him calm down. She came back every 20 minutes to check on him even though she had other patients, bringing juice boxes and adjusting his pillows and making sure he felt safe. 2 days later, Prosecutor Clifford Vaughn introduced himself in the hospital lobby, explaining he'd been assigned to handle the criminal case against both Sasha and Harper. He laid out the charges they were pursuing, including aggravated child abuse, fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying medical records, each carrying serious prison time. He warned me the process would take months or maybe years, that Sean might have to testify about what happened to him, that Sasha's lawyer would try to paint her as mentally ill rather than criminal. He'd already interviewed the surgical team and had their statements about following the falsified chart, plus the IT department's records showing exactly when and how Harper made the changes. The surgeon came to visit again the next evening when he was off duty, still wearing regular clothes instead of scrubs, and broke down crying right there in the hallway outside Sean's room. He told me he had 2 kids around Sean's age and couldn't stop thinking about what he'd done, couldn't sleep, couldn't operate without seeing Sean on that table. He said following protocol didn't make it okay, that he should have questioned why a 12-year-old needed an emergency amputation, should have called to verify, should have done something. He stood there sobbing while other families walked past staring, and I didn't know what to say because part of me wanted to comfort him, but part of me wanted to scream that his guilt didn't help my son. The child psychologist Zahra Hassan started working with Sean using toy figures and art supplies, letting him express feelings he couldn't put into words. She had him draw pictures of his family and himself, and he drew everyone with normal bodies except himself, who he drew with a missing leg and angry scribbles where his foot should be. When she asked him to draw how he felt, he grabbed a black marker and covered the entire paper until it ripped, then threw the marker across the room. She didn't scold him, just handed him another paper and let him destroy that one too, saying sometimes anger needs to come out physically before words can follow. Reed helped me go through our bank statements while Sean was in therapy, and we discovered Sasha had been moving money for weeks before the surgery. She'd emptied our savings account the week before, transferred everything to an account in just her name that I couldn't touch. She'd also taken cash advances on our credit cards, sold jewelry I'd bought her over the years, even cashed out her retirement fund, moving everything somewhere I couldn't find it. Reed helped me file emergency motions to freeze any accounts we could find, but the lawyer said most of the money was probably already gone or hidden where we'd never recover it. 3 days later, Nolan called me while I was sitting with Sean during his morning medication routine and told me Harper's lawyer wanted to meet about a possible deal. I drove to his office that afternoon while Reed stayed with Sean and found the lawyer already waiting in the conference room with a stack of papers. She pushed a document across the table showing Harper would testify against Sasha about the whole plan in exchange for reduced charges from 10 years down to maybe 3. Nolan read through it carefully and made notes while the other lawyer tapped her pen on the table and kept checking her phone. The prosecutor joined us 20 minutes later and said Harper's cooperation was valuable for proving premeditation, but she'd still serve real prison time no matter what deal they made. The lawyer tried arguing Harper was manipulated, but the prosecutor pulled out printed text messages where Harper suggested which specific medical conditions would work best for their plan. That evening, Sean was coloring with Zara when he suddenly stopped and asked if Mommy made him sick on purpose because he heard nurses talking about fake records. I froze completely while Zara put down her clipboard and moved closer to him on the floor. She helped me explain that sometimes adults make bad choices that hurt people they love, but it wasn't his fault, and he didn't do anything wrong. Sean kept coloring but pressed harder with the crayons until one snapped and he threw the pieces across the room. The next morning, the hospital CEO called asking me to attend an announcement about new safety protocols they were implementing because of what happened to Sean. I showed up to find a room full of reporters and administrators while the CEO stood at a podium explaining their new verification system requiring 3 separate confirmations for any major surgery. He turned to me halfway through and apologized personally, while lawyers behind him took notes on everything he said and photographers snapped pictures of my face. They showed flowcharts of the new process and promised this could never happen again, but I just kept thinking about how Sean was in physical therapy right then learning to use crutches. Reed called me that night practically yelling because he'd been going through Sasha's laptop and found bookmark folders labeled disability benefits and inspirational amputee stories dating back 4 months. He sent screenshots to Nolan showing articles about college scholarships for disabled students and YouTube videos of kids with prosthetics playing sports that she'd saved. The browser history showed she'd spent hours researching which disabilities got the most financial support and even downloaded PDFs about insurance payouts for medical malpractice cases. The next physical therapy session turned into a disaster when Sean refused to put any weight on his remaining foot, even though the therapist kept explaining it was completely healthy. He sat on the mat crying that it hurt, even though x-rays showed nothing wrong, and the therapist tried different approaches to get him standing. She finally explained that phantom pain from missing limbs was real, and his brain was still sending signals to a foot that wasn't there anymore. Plus, the fear of losing another foot was making him protect the one he had left. 2 weeks passed before the social worker called to schedule a final meeting about their custody investigation at the courthouse. She went through her report saying I was clearly a fit parent who'd tried to protect Sean, and they were recommending full custody with supervised visits only if Sasha made bail, which seemed unlikely given the charges. She stamped the papers and said she was genuinely sorry about everything that happened and wished more parents fought as hard as I did for their kids. Nolan filed our civil lawsuit the next day, naming the hospital, 3 individual doctors, the electronic records company, and 2 software vendors as defendants in a case seeking both damages and systemic changes. He explained we weren't just going after money, but wanted to force real changes in how medical records got verified, so no other family would go through this. The hospital's lawyers responded within hours trying to schedule settlement talks, but Nolan said we'd wait until we had more leverage from the criminal case. That weekend, Sasha's mother called while I was helping Sean with homework and started screaming that I was lying about her daughter because Sasha would never hurt her grandson. I emailed her the arrest report and the criminal charges plus newspaper articles about the case, and she never called back or even tried to visit Sean. The prosthetist arrived Tuesday morning with cases of equipment and spent 2 hours taking detailed molds of Sean's residual limb while explaining how they'd build his first prosthetic leg. Sean actually paid attention when the guy showed him different materials and let him pick the color scheme for the socket, and even smiled a little when he said kids usually went with superhero themes. They scheduled another appointment for measurements once the swelling went down more and left catalogs of different foot options that Sean spent the rest of the day looking through. Detective Walter stopped by that afternoon with a thick folder and showed me printouts from Sasha's search history that made everything worse. She'd spent weeks researching which hospitals had the weakest verification systems and specifically chose ours because Harper worked at the company that managed their record system. The searches included things like hospital lawsuit settlements and how much money for wrongful amputation and can hospitals reverse amputations, proving she knew exactly what she was doing and picked our hospital as the easiest target. Zara called us in for our 3rd therapy session that Thursday, and Sean sat on the couch picking at the bandages on his residual limb while she pulled out some sports magazines. He looked up at the pictures of athletes and asked if he'd ever play soccer again, and his voice cracked halfway through the question. Zara showed him videos on her tablet of amputee athletes running and kicking soccer balls and explained that lots of kids with prosthetics played sports once they got used to their new legs. His face actually lit up for the first time since the surgery, and he asked a dozen questions about how the special sports prosthetics worked and whether he could still be goalie. While we were there, the hospital's risk manager left 3 voicemails saying they needed to meet immediately about their internal investigation. I called back from the parking lot, and she told me they'd found 3 other cases where Harper had accessed medical records without authorization, though thankfully none had resulted in any procedures. They were contacting those families now, and their legal team was scrambling to figure out their liability if Harper had changed anything else in the system. Reed showed up at our house that weekend with his truck full of stuff from the hardware store and started installing a basketball hoop in the driveway that could be lowered all the way down to 6 feet. He didn't make a big deal about it or even mention why he was doing it, but I saw him testing different heights and making sure the concrete was perfectly level for when Sean would eventually be ready to play. Monday morning, a thick envelope arrived from Sasha's lawyer, and inside was a handwritten letter where she claimed she did this out of love and only wanted to secure Sean's future. The letter went on for 4 pages about how hard life is without money and how she was protecting him from poverty and giving him opportunities he'd never have otherwise. Nolan read it over and told me to keep it as evidence of her continued delusion and complete lack of remorse since she still thought she'd done the right thing. The surgeon stopped by Sean's room during rounds Tuesday and pulled me aside to say he was requesting to be removed from the case because he couldn't be objective anymore. His colleague would take over Sean's care starting tomorrow, but I noticed him checking on us from the hallway several times that week, even though he wasn't officially involved anymore. Wednesday afternoon, Sean's teacher showed up with a huge envelope of cards from his classmates, and Sean actually smiled genuinely for the first time since the surgery while reading them. She sat with him for an hour going through each card and promised she'd help make sure he didn't fall behind and would work with the school to make whatever accommodations he needed when he was ready to come back. That evening, Vaughn called to tell me what they'd found in the evidence from Harper's computer, and it made everything even worse. Harper and Sasha had exchanged over 200 messages planning this whole thing, including detailed discussions about which type of amputation would generate the most sympathy and therefore the most money. They'd debated between below knee and above knee and decided below knee would still get plenty of sympathy, but leave Sean more functional, which would make for better publicity opportunities later. The custody hearing was scheduled for Friday, and I sat in the courtroom watching Sasha in her orange jumpsuit while the judge reviewed all the evidence. The judge granted me temporary sole custody with Sasha, having absolutely no contact with Sean until the criminal case was resolved, and possibly not even then. Sasha started screaming from the defendant's table that I was stealing her son and poisoning him against her and had to be physically restrained by the bailiffs. The following week, Sean started working with the parallel bars in physical therapy and took his first real steps since the surgery. He gripped the bars so tight his knuckles went white, and his face showed pure determination mixed with frustration as everything felt completely different from before. The physical therapist kept praising his effort and telling him he was doing great, but I could see him fighting back angry tears when his residual limb hurt and his balance was all wrong. Reed found a support group for families dealing with traumatic amputations that met Thursday nights at the community center and started going with me. Hearing other parents talk about their kids losing limbs in accidents or to cancer and how they'd gotten through it made me realize we weren't alone in this nightmare, and maybe we really would survive somehow. 2 weeks later, the hospital's risk manager called Nolan asking for a meeting about settlement options. We sat in a conference room with their legal team while they pushed a thick folder across the table. Inside was an offer for $3 million with standard legal language about no admission of wrongdoing. Nolan barely glanced at it before sliding it back and telling them we needed time to consider. Outside, he explained we could push for much more than money since they needed this to go away quietly. He wanted mandatory verification protocols and actual safety reforms that would prevent this from happening to other kids. The hospital's lawyers looked uncomfortable when Nolan mentioned going public with the story. That same afternoon, Zara called me in for Sean's weekly assessment and showed me her notes from their sessions. She said he was showing clear signs of PTSD with nightmares and flashbacks, but also something remarkable. He was bouncing back faster than most kids in similar trauma situations. She adjusted his treatment plan to include more physical activities that would help build his confidence back up. Swimming lessons at the therapy pool started the next day, and Sean actually seemed excited about something for the first time in weeks. 3 days later, Vaughn called with news about Harper's case that made me sit down hard on the kitchen floor. She'd agreed to plead guilty to all charges, including fraud and conspiracy to commit assault. In exchange for a lighter sentence, she was giving them everything about Sasha's plan. Her signed statement said Sasha promised her $50,000 from the settlement money they'd get. Harper had emails and texts going back 4 months, showing how they'd planned every detail. The following Monday was the day Sean had been waiting for since his stump healed enough. The prosthetist brought in his first prosthetic leg and spent 2 hours teaching him how to put it on correctly. Sean's hands shook as he rolled the liner onto his residual limb and clicked the prosthetic into place. He stood up carefully and took 3 wobbly steps before sitting back down to adjust the fit. By the end of the session, he could walk to the door and back without falling. He named it Robot Leg right there in the office and asked if he could put superhero stickers on it. The prosthetist said absolutely, and even had some in his desk drawer for kids. That night, Sean slept with the prosthetic next to his bed and checked on it twice to make sure it was still there. A week passed before we heard from the medical board about their investigation into the surgeon's actions. The official letter cleared him of any wrongdoing since he'd followed all established protocols with the information available. What he had in the chart looked completely legitimate, with multiple confirmations across different systems. 2 days later, I found a handwritten letter in our mailbox from him personally. He wrote that the board's decision didn't ease his conscience, and he'd carry this with him forever. He was starting a foundation to push for better verification systems nationwide. Vaughn met with us the next week to discuss Sasha's upcoming trial, which was set for 3 months out. He warned me it would be emotionally brutal watching her try to justify what she'd done. The evidence was overwhelming and he was confident about conviction, but Sasha was still insisting she'd helped Sean. She'd fired 2 lawyers already for refusing to argue that the amputation was actually beneficial. Her current lawyer was letting her represent herself, which Vaughn said would make conviction even easier. The physical therapy gym was packed the morning Sean decided he was ready to walk without the parallel bars. Reed and I watched from the side as he stood up from the bench and adjusted his prosthetic. The therapist stayed close but didn't touch him as he took one careful step forward. Then another. Then another. His face showed complete focus as he managed 10 steps before his residual limb started hurting. Reed and I cheered like he'd just won the Olympics, and for the first time since the surgery, Sean actually laughed. Not a forced laugh, but a real one that made his whole face light up. The therapist high-fived him and said he was ahead of schedule. 2 weeks later, Nolan called with news that the hospital was implementing our suggested reforms immediately. They didn't wait for the settlement negotiations to finish before adding mandatory callback verification for all major procedures. Any surgery involving amputation now required 2 separate confirmations from the patient or guardian. Nolan called it a victory, even though it felt hollow, knowing what it cost to get these changes. During Thursday's therapy session, Zara showed me a drawing Sean had made of his family. There was him with his prosthetic, me, Reed, and then Sasha crossed out with black marker. When Zara asked him about it, he said something that made my chest tight. "I hate Mommy for taking my foot." It was the first time he directly expressed anger at her, instead of just confusion. Zara explained this was actually healthy progress since he needed to process all his emotions. Bottling up the anger would only make things worse later. She gave him permission to feel mad, and that seemed to help. The next Saturday, Reed showed up with a flyer for a youth amputee sports program that met at the rec center. He'd already called, and they had space for Sean in the beginner group. We drove over that afternoon and walked into a gym full of kids with prosthetics playing basketball. Sean stopped in the doorway and stared as a girl about his age dribbled past on one leg. Another boy had 2 prosthetic legs and was shooting free throws. The coach came over and introduced himself, then called over 3 kids to meet Sean. Within minutes, they were showing him their different prosthetics and comparing stickers. One boy had flames on his and said Sean's superhero theme was cool. Watching Sean realize he wasn't alone in this made my eyes burn. Reed and I went to the parking lot and I completely lost it while he patted my back. These kids were just playing and laughing like any other sports team. Sean had found his people. 3 weeks later, Nolan called me at work to say the electronic records company wanted to meet about a settlement. Their lawyers showed up with briefcases and serious faces, admitting their security system had failed and Harper shouldn't have been able to access those records. They offered $800,000 to avoid trial, and I watched Nolan negotiate it up to $1.2 million with additional security audit requirements. He set up a trust for Sean that would cover his medical needs, adaptive equipment, and college when he was ready. The company's CEO signed the papers himself and apologized, saying they'd already fired 12 people and rebuilt their entire verification system. Meanwhile, Vaughn called to tell me Sasha had fired her 3rd lawyer that morning because he refused to argue the amputation was actually good for Sean. The judge warned her about representing herself, but she stood up and said she knew the law better than these cowards who wouldn't fight for a mother's rights. Vaughn said this would make his job easier since she kept admitting things on the record that damaged her case. She filed 17 motions in 2 days, all of them rejected, demanding everything from a new judge to having me arrested for kidnapping. The court clerk told Vaughn she'd never seen someone sabotage their own defense so thoroughly. 2 months had passed when Sean's teacher called to say he was ready to try returning to the school part-time. We started with just mornings, 3 days a week, with an aide to help him navigate the hallways. His classmates had made welcome back cards, and one kid gave him stickers for his prosthetic. The principal met us at the door that first day and walked Sean to class herself. During math, his prosthetic came loose, and instead of getting upset, he made a joke about his leg trying to escape algebra. His teacher emailed me that afternoon saying he was using humor to handle the hard moments and the other kids were following his lead, treating him normally instead of tiptoeing around him. The hospital's lawyers scheduled another meeting where they presented their final settlement offer. Nolan had pushed them hard, and they agreed to cover all of Sean's prosthetics for life, including upgrades as technology improved. They added unlimited physical therapy, psychological support through age 21, and a separate fund for adaptive sports equipment. The total package was worth over $4 million when you calculated the lifetime medical coverage. They also agreed to name the new verification protocol after Sean and fund annual training for all surgical staff. Zara had us come in for family therapy the following Thursday, and Sean surprised me with a question I should have expected. "Do I have to see Mommy again?" He was drawing while he talked, not looking at me, his hands steady on the paper. I told him that when he was older it would be his choice, that no one could force him to see her if he didn't want to. His shoulders relaxed and he added more details to his drawing, finally seeming to have some control over something in his life. Zara nodded at me. confirming I'd handled it right. That weekend, Reed showed up with swimming trunks and said we were going to the pool at his gym. I watched him get in the water with Sean, showing him how to balance with one foot, how to use his arms more for stability. Sean was scared at first, clinging to the pool edge, but Reed stayed patient, and within an hour they were moving across the shallow end together. Other swimmers stopped to watch, and one man who had a prosthetic arm came over to give Sean tips. Reed never asked for thanks, never made a big deal about spending every weekend with us, just showed up ready to be the uncle Sean needed. I realized my brother had become the stable male figure in Sean's life, while I was drowning in legal battles and medical appointments. Harper's sentencing was set for a Tuesday morning, and Vaughn said we should attend for closure. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, and Harper looked different in her orange jumpsuit, thinner and older somehow. The judge gave her 5 years with possibility of parole in 2, and she turned to us crying and apologizing. Sean didn't look up from the drawing pad Zara had suggested he bring, focusing on his picture of a soccer player with a robot leg. Harper's mother was sobbing in the back row, but we left without acknowledging her. 2 days later, the surgeon called asking to meet for coffee, and he told me about his new foundation for verification protocols in hospitals nationwide. He wanted to name it after Sean with our permission, funding it with his own money to create something positive from his unwitting participation. He'd already gotten 3 major hospitals to sign on for the pilot program, and the medical board was considering making it mandatory statewide. I signed the permission form, and he promised Sean would never pay for any medical care at their facility. The Adaptive Soccer League had their first game of the season, and Sean insisted on playing even though he'd only been to 4 practices. He used his crutches to balance while hopping on one foot, moving faster than anyone expected. In the second half, he managed to steal the ball from another kid and hop-dribbled it down the field. Parents were cheering, and his teammates set up a wall to help him score. When the ball went in, the net Sean threw his crutches in the air, and his pure joy made everyone cry, including the referee. Reed got it on video, and Sean watched it 20 times that night. Finally, Sasha's trial arrived after months of delays and motions. The courtroom was packed with reporters since the story had gotten national attention. She'd dressed herself in a suit that didn't fit right and had done her own hair and makeup badly. When they read the charges, she stood up and called them lies, saying she was a loving mother who only wanted the best for her son. The prosecutor presented text messages, browser history, financial records, and Harper's testimony. Sasha kept objecting incorrectly, and the judge had to explain basic court procedures to her. When they showed the messages where she calculated how much money they'd make from Sean's amputation, several jurors looked sick. She took the stand against everyone's advice and claimed the amputation had made Sean special, that he'd thank her someday for giving him opportunities. The prosecutor asked if she felt any remorse, and she said only that the hospital hadn't paid enough yet. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. The judge sentenced her to 15 years with possibility of parole in 7, and Sasha screamed about injustice while they handcuffed her. She yelled that I'd poisoned Sean against her, that she'd sue everyone, that this wasn't over, still refusing to acknowledge what she'd stolen from our son. 6 months passed before I saw Sean take his first real running steps with the prosthetic. He'd been practicing in physical therapy, but today he wanted to try outside on the track behind the rec center. The carbon fiber blade made a soft clicking sound against the rubber surface as he started slow. His arms pumped awkwardly, and his balance shifted wrong. He went down hard on his left knee and scraped both palms bloody. Reed started forward, but I grabbed his arm because Sean was already pushing himself back up. He wiped his hands on his shorts, leaving red streaks, and lined up again at the starting line. This time, he made it 20 feet before his prosthetic caught wrong and sent him tumbling sideways onto the grass. The other kids at the track stopped to watch, but Sean ignored them completely. He adjusted the socket where it connected below his knee and stood up again. His face was red and sweaty and determined. He started running again, and this time his rhythm clicked into place. Left foot, blade, left foot, blade, each step getting more confident. He ran straight toward me with this huge smile breaking across his face. When he crashed into my arms, we both nearly fell over, but I held him tight while he breathed hard against my chest. The settlement money came through 2 weeks later, and we started looking at houses immediately. The old place had Sasha's presence in every room, and Sean needed somewhere new to heal. We found a single-story ranch with wide doorways and a bathroom already set up with grab bars. Reed came over with his truck and helped us pack everything worth keeping. Sean picked a bedroom with big windows facing the backyard where we planned to put up that adjustable basketball hoop. The moving day was chaos with boxes everywhere, and Sean directing where his stuff should go. Reed stayed until midnight helping us unpack the kitchen and set up beds. When everything was done, Sean stood in his new room arranging his prosthetic supplies in the special cabinet we'd bought. This was our fresh start without any ghosts haunting the hallways. Zara called the next week to discuss reducing our sessions since Sean was doing so well. She came by the new house and watched him navigate the space confidently with his prosthetic. He showed her his homework and his drawings, which had shifted from angry scribbles to detailed pictures of athletes with prosthetics. She pulled me aside while Sean was getting a snack and said his adaptation was remarkable considering the trauma. We'd keep monthly check-ins, but she felt he was genuinely processing and moving forward. The healing wasn't linear, and there would still be hard days, but the crisis phase had passed. That Thursday afternoon, Sean came to me with his tablet asking if we could write something together. He wanted to make a letter for other kids who were getting prosthetics to tell them it wasn't as scary as it seemed. We sat at the kitchen table working on it for 2 hours. He insisted on including the parts about falling and getting frustrated because kids needed to know that was normal. He wrote about naming his prosthetic and decorating it and how it felt weird at first, but got easier. The hospital loved it and asked permission to post it in their pediatric ward. Sean signed the permission form carefully and asked if kids could write back to him. Within a month, 3 kids had sent letters, and Sean answered each one with specific advice about sockets and walking techniques. Vaughn called on a Tuesday morning while Sean was at the school to update me on Sasha's appeal. The judge had reviewed everything and denied it completely, finding no errors in the original trial. She'd served the full 15 years with earliest parole in 7. I thanked him and hung up feeling nothing but relief that Sean was protected. When Sean got home, I didn't mention the call, but made his favorite dinner and watched him do homework at the table. He was safe from her influence, and that's all that mattered now. The year anniversary of getting his prosthetic came faster than expected. Reed came over with a cake shaped like a robot leg, which made Sean laugh, so hard milk came out his nose. After dinner, they went outside to play basketball on the court we'd had installed. Sean's movements were smooth now as he dribbled and pivoted and shot. He made 3 baskets in a row, then did this victory dance that involved hopping on his good foot while waving the prosthetic in the air. Reed lifted him up on his shoulders and ran around the court while Sean held his arms out like airplane wings. Watching them, I realized Sean wasn't just surviving anymore, but actually thriving. That night after Reed left, Sean sat next to me on the couch with his laptop. He'd been researching medical schools and wanted to show me the ones with good disability support programs. He said he wanted to be a doctor who helped kids like him and already knew which specialties interested him. We spent 2 hours looking at requirements and programs and scholarship opportunities. Sean took notes in his careful handwriting about prerequisite classes and volunteer hours. This was him transforming his trauma into purpose and planning a future nobody could steal. Later, I checked on him before bed and found him sleeping peacefully with one arm thrown over his head. His prosthetic was charging on its stand next to the bed with tomorrow's soccer uniform laid out on his chair. The nightlight cast soft shadows, and his breathing was deep and even. No nightmares tonight. Standing there watching him, I finally believed we were going to be okay. All right, that's all from me today, folks. Thanks for letting me poke around and throw some questions out there with you all. It's always fun hanging out like this. Subscribe for more content like this.